Okay, so we've UV mapped our snake. And so now the question is, how do we go from this to body paint? And what does that even mean? And so body paint is essentially Photoshop's painting and some of their like image manipulation stuff brought into Cinema4D. So much so that you can actually export brushes from Photoshop to use in Cinema4D. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and now that we've got these beautiful UVs, we're going to go ahead and paint on them. And we're going to look at, and we'll also look at how to take these UV grids and bring them into Photoshop so that if we want to do manipulation there, we can, right? Some of us are much more comfortable using Photoshop than we're going to ever be using Bodypaint 3D, and we'll just get really frustrated with it. So let's go ahead and make this change. So what we're going to do is we are going to change our layout from BP UV Edit to BP 3D Paint. When we do that, you'll see that we get things. Now I actually have this, usually when you open this up, the brush is the first tool you get. But when you get that brush right now, I have a no symbol on my mesh, right? I can't use it, and I can't use any of these tools. And so the simplest way to start body painting an object is to come up here and hover over the Paint Setup wizard. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And what that does is it basically asks what object do you want to paint, and then what it's going to do is it's going to generate a new material and new texture maps that we're going to be painting on. So I don't want to paint the capsule. All I want is the danger noodle, and the spline doesn't even have a check mark next to it because you can't paint something that has no volume, right? So, and we want to make sure it's set to objects, and we're going to go ahead and click next. And then this step is important. We do not want to recalculate the UVs, right? We've already taken all this time to create UVs and to calculate them manually, more or less. We don't want to recalculate them, right? There's a couple ways that they are recalculated, and you can always take any object in here, even if you haven't done UVs, and you can just recalculate the UVs, and it'll either do optimal cubic mapping, optimal angle mapping, or automatic packed UVs, right? But we don't want to do that in this case because we've done this. And one of the things that'll happen is, right, we saw what happened when it made choices as to where to make the cut, and it was making the cut on the top surface, which was problematic. And other times, if it's a really complex object, you're going to have all these tiny little UV islands all over the place, and it's going to be a nightmare. So we're going to uncheck that, and we are going to hit next. And then this is where we choose what channels we want to be able to paint on. And we can do this later as well. And then also it lets us choose like a default color for a default fill for the layer that for the item we're creating. And so we're going to go ahead and do color. Let's go ahead and throw bump on here as well for the time being. And I'll show you how to create other layers in the future. So we've got those two. Now the next thing that we want to do is this maximum size. This is telling us basically what's the highest resolution our image can be. And depending on what you're doing, what your intent is, if you're going for like photorealistic quality, you're going to want far more than 1024 pixels spread all over this entire model, right? Because if you remember, our UVs are only taking up a small section of that entire space, so we're going to have a lot of pixelation. So I'm actually going to bump this up 4 times, so it's going to be 4096 is our maximum size. And the minimum size, basically we could set it to 4096 here as well, so then it will be a square. Otherwise it might be a little bit unsquare, but it doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead, and we don't have any existing textures applied to this. And we don't need to worry about any of those other things. We're just going to go ahead and say finish. Now, as soon as we do that, it gives us this little thing. It says what happened. It created this texture. It tells us how big it was. And then it just says that it's done. And you can see the color's a little darker. And you can see that now I can paint on this. So I'm going to go ahead and hit close. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and I have my brush selected. I'm going to click on it again just to make sure the attributes are up here. And you'll see that the size is set to 10, right? I'm going to make that a little bit larger, maybe even bigger, because what I want to do is I just want to show you, right? One of the things that we've done now is basically whenever this brush is over the body of this thing, the circle should actually be a circle, right? As it gets down closer to the tail here, I'm going to go ahead and move this. Right, it gets a little bit more warped, but actually it's still circular. It's just all the way around there. Now, if we hadn't mapped these UVs, what would likely be happening is that this would be distorted, right? So instead of being a circle, it'd be a a really long oval, or it'd be in some everywhere we went. But here it stays. You can see the scale changes a little bit, but overall it stays pretty evenly round, which is exactly what we want, right? You can see on the side of the head here. That's where some of those problems are, right? And if we go and flip over to the bottom, where we have our seam, right, you will see where the seam is, it looks like it disappears until it pops over. And what happens is it just becomes really hard to make a nice even mark on there, and you have to be really careful. And you have to do a lot of work on the edges if you want to get it to blend nicely. And so that's just something to be aware of, right? And so if we were just, before we do any work whatsoever though, before you may have already clicked and dragged and painted on your snake somewhere. But before we do that, we need to talk about layers and how this, how we, work in a way that makes it so that we can undo what we've done, or we can create layers of that we're working on. And so if we come over here to the top pane up here, we're in our colors panel. And what that's got is, there's several different options here. Right now, we just have channels, blending, color, and wallpaper. And so the two channels that we've got are C and B, right? Color and bump. And so, whichever one is highlighted in blue is the one we're currently working on, right? Now, the other thing you can do, which we'll talk about in a bit, is it's also whichever one has the highlighted pen, right? So if I click on the pen, and I think, there we go. And if I hold down Shift and click, I can actually draw on both channels at the same time with a single brush stroke, right? Usually you don't want to do that, so I'm just going to deselect the brushes there and then select back here. Now, at this point, you'll see it says no, right? I've deselected both of those little brush icons. This is one of the things that Bodypaint does that's kind of aggravating to me. It's really hard to figure out what you need to do to draw on something, right? And so right now I've made it so I can't draw. I'm like, what the heck's going on? And it's because I don't have this little pen icon or paintbrush icon clicked on here. And now that it's clicked on, I have the channel selected and I can adjust it, right? So there's also the colors down here, right? This is the standard color interface. If I click on this little but here it does, basically it copies the same thing that's down here, right? I have an eyedropper, so I can pick a color if I want to. I can either do solid color or I can do texture paint. And texture paint basically allows you to load textures that you can use to paint, right? So let me just see if I can grab that snake skin, which probably is not going to be the best option, because really what I would like is, let's just do like, sure, let's just do a picture of the earth, right? Because that's what needs to be on the snake, right? So I can choose this JPEG, and then as I paint, like I'm actually painting that, right, that texture, and you can see it's being tiled. This is something that, obviously this isn't the way this tool is intended to be used. But what this allows you to do is, if you had a texture, like I was hoping for like broken earth or soil, like I know I have those textures on my computer. I know I have paper textures as well. But it's something where you can use that like a seamless texture and paint that on the surface, right? Rather than just painting on solid color. So let's go back to our solid color because that's what we're going to work with for now. And so we've got our channels here. Now there's several other options up here. There's materials, and if you look at materials, you'll see that this is a different view of the material editor, right? Or the material manager. It's got a bunch of different options on here. There's one here that has a red X, and there's one here that has a paintbrush. If it has a red X, that means that you're not currently using it as a layer that you can paint on. Sorry, not a layer, as a material you can paint on, right? If you check mark that, if you click on that red check mark, then that becomes something that you can manipulate with the brushes in Bodypaint, right? We're not going to do that for that channel right now, for that material right now, but this is the material we're working on, right? And so you can see we've got one option here, and if I was to go ahead and paint on here, I'd get a little update where it was painted on the texture. And the other option here, this is the bump channel. So if I click on the bump channel and I was to paint, I only painted on this other channel because you can see I have the paintbrush highlighted here, but not here. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to come back over here, turn this on. And so then now if I click on the bump channel, that white smooth edge didn't really do a whole lot. So let's go ahead and make the hardness on this brush pretty hard and make the size a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to see if I can there we go. So right, it's a little hard to see in this model if I zoom in a little bit, but you can see I'm actually drawing in the bump channel. So now there's actual texture being applied as I paint with this. Okay, let's go back to the color channel. We're going to turn off the paintbrush on the bump, turn the paintbrush on the color channel. And the other thing here is there's this little flip open thing, right? What we're seeing, what these two little icons are layers, right? And right now, each of these channels just has one layer. It basically has a background layer. If I go and click on the layers option, you'll see I have this matte.1_color.tiff, right? And I currently have a background layer. If I go back to if I go back to materials and I select this other channel, then what happens is if I go here, you'll see this is matte.1_bump.tiff, right? These are two separate textures. One texture is for bump, one texture is for color, right? And so if I go back to materials and I choose the color channel and I go to layers, I can create a new layer in a couple ways. I can either go to under functions, I can say new layer set, duplicate layer, flatten layers, blah, 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 add layer mask, right? All of these things are similar to what you can do in Photoshop with layers. If I go ahead and hit the create new layer option down here, right? These are those same buttons, they're really tiny, but they're there. And so now I have this new layer that I can paint on. And much like Photoshop, I can turn the visibility of a layer on or off. So let's go ahead and do some painting on your object. And we'll do it on this layer. And I'm going to go ahead and just make this snake maybe have some red dots on it. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Oh, they're still white dots. Why are they white dots? Oh, because I do not have the saturation set. Right, and so I can just come along here, and if I want to be painting dots on the body of this, I can do that. I could make these larger, right, as the body goes along, but in this case, right, all I'm doing is just creating a few dots along the top surface of this object. Right, so now if I wanted to taper them down, I could. I can also additionally add one in there because I didn't do the best job spacing them. Right, so I've got some red dots in there, so let's do like a base color for this object, right? We've got that, that first layer, but let's go ahead and start making some other changes. So I'm going to go back to layers. I'm actually going to create another new layer. And this time I'm going to go ahead and pull this down. And I'm going to undo that because that turned it into a mask. I'm going to go ahead and grab this and see, and there we go. So if I grab this and pull it down here, I can get it between those two, right? And so then one of the tools that we've got over here is there's this gradient tool. And so we can create a gradient. Now, it might be kind of tricky using the gradient on the body of the snake, but I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag and see what happens there. Yeah, see how it, the way it's set up, it's, you know, wide over here, but it really didn't do what I wanted it to do. And so, right, that's a tool where it might not be, even if I pull down this way, right, it might not be the, because look, now it's over here as well, right? It might not be the best tool to use in 3D paint mode. And so what I'd really like to do is be able to look at the image, and I really want the gradient to say go horizontally across the body, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here, and where I have view, I also have this texture view, right? And now you can see I have my UVs here. It looks like I might have made a mistake down here with my UVs. It looks like I grabbed a point and moved something over. So I'm probably going to adjust that here in a little bit, but not right now, because this is what's important to focus on. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to be able to see what I'm working on. So what I can do is I click on this textures menu. Now I have, well, I was making a really silly Trump thing, but I have the ability to look at the color. I have the ability to look at the other options. I'm going to turn this UV map off. I'm going to say empty canvas. I'm going to go down to map 1 color. There we go. And then also I don't need to see that distortion anymore. So under view, I'm going to turn off distortion. Right, so all I see is this. So now with my gradient selected, I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments, right? I want this to go, I don't know, from maybe orange, somewhere in the orange range. I want to add another point in the center, but I want that to be, let's say, teal. And then at the end, I want to go ahead and grab this point, but what I want to do is I actually just want to grab that same orange, right? So I'm going to have teal in the middle, orange on the sides. And because I have this set up this way, what I can do is I can just find somewhere around the fattest chunk, and I could click and drag to horizontally apply this gradient, right? And I did a reasonably good job. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like when we go to our body paint view. So we're going to switch back to view, right? And so now I've got this gradient that minus the head applies evenly across the entire surface of this body, the direction that I wanted it to, right? So body paint is a mix of doing this in 3D mode and doing it in 2D mode, right? And that's kind of one of the ways that we can work with this. And so you can start to see that there's a lot of interesting things that we can do. So one of the things we haven't looked at is the blending, right? So if I hold down Shift and click on blending here, you'll see that for every layer I can adjust the opacity, right? So I don't even know what layer I'm on right now. I should be on the, I should be, still have this selected, yep, okay. Oh, sorry. This blending is how the brush blends with, that you have selected blends with what you've already done on your layer, right? So this is the same blending as if you're using a brush in Photoshop and you go up to the top and do that. If you want to adjust the blending of a layer, you do that in the layers panel where you can adjust the opacity. And you can also choose the blend mode here, right? So I can say, you know, oh, I want this to be and there's nothing underneath right now that's really all that interesting. It's just this gray background. So maybe what I can do is change that up a little bit by maybe just going ahead and selecting that. And even though usually I want this to be plain, I'm going to grab my brush, and you've noticed I've just had like a circle brush or a rectangle brush. Let's go ahead and look at some of the other options, and we'll paint this on this lower layer. So if I click on brushes here, if you've installed the presets, you should have a whole bunch of brushes. If you haven't done that yet, you should, because this has, right, all sorts of different things, right? Chalks and pastels. If I double click on any of these, once I get down to these menus, you can see all of these different options. And you can change this right to set to be icons. This makes it so much easier to view. And so maybe I want one of these where it's a super textury looking thing. And with that, I'm going to make my size significantly larger, maybe this big. And then I am going to set the spacing, which, triggers how frequently these get drawn. So is it going to be like a smeary brush stroke, or is it going to be more like a, staggered, right? And I'm going to increase the jitter some, and I'll increase the jitter count on both axes, right? Because I really want this to just be all over the place. And so I've got that brush set. So let's set a color that is maybe not pink. Let's make it like a green or something really annoying. I'm going to start on the head because why not? And why am I not seeing anything? So I'm not seeing anything because this layer is 100% opaque and it's set to normal. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn this off for the time being so I can actually see what I'm doing. And I have to select the actual layer. If you saw that alert, it was because that was turned off, and so I can't draw on a layer that I can't see, right? And so now if I just come around here and just splatter this around, and maybe come over here where I've missed some and go down to the tail where I've missed some as well, right? And come underneath, and this is where you'll see, right, you can kind of see where that edge, like if I don't get it, I get that hard, crisp edge in there, right? So I have to make sure that I come on the other side and make that happen. And I might actually undo a few of those so I can more smoothly, right, texture that. I wish it would roll over a little bit better than it does, but unfortunately that is not how the cookie crumbles. Okay, so I've made some more texture on here. It looks like the head is really green right now, but that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this layer back on. And then when I select this layer, I'm going to change this to, let's just try screen, and then reduce the opacity of this and see what happens. Right, so you can see how with multiple layers, much like in Photoshop or even Illustrator, and changing some of these things, right, I can very easily create pretty complex textures. Now, right, I've just been doing this in I'm trying to find a good blend mode that will work nicely. Maybe overlay. There we go. That's a little bit better. And maybe I increase the opacity of it. I don't know. Somewhere in there. Right. So you can see that I can very easily begin painting on these surfaces. And now if I go ahead and render this, you'll see the actual intensity of that. Now I can also add lights in here and do all sorts of other things. And we haven't done any texture on the other layer. So let's go on the other channel. So let's go back to our materials. Let's select our bump channel. Let's turn the color channel off for the time being. Right, and we only have one layer, so we can also have layers on the bump channel. So let's go ahead and go to layers. Let's add a layer, and let's use the same brush to add texture. And so I'm going to go ahead and, maybe just click, maybe click and drag to apply a little bit more texture to this. I don't see a whole lot being applied, but I know it's probably happening. I can see it happening, right? And if I render this now, you'll actually see that there is texture on there, right? It's subtle, but it's there. Oops, there we go. And so, yeah, so I can add, you know, a couple layers of texture here, right? And then if I wanted to come in and I wanted to do something else on top of that, right, I can always add another layer. I can go to my brushes, and I have no idea what I would add on top of that. But let's say we wanted to use this brush to add maybe little like heavier spots of texture. Maybe they're on these dots, I don't know. Right, so I can come in here and I can add a bit more bump texture. Okay. And I can render this. You can kind of see what it did. You know, it's not the best. I'm just sort of trying to do this quickly. I don't know why it chose to do that, but right, so I've got some texture coming in. Part of this is I have my color set not quite as white as it could be. If I want this, you know, the bump that I'm applying to be set into the surface, right, I can always come in here and actually, you know, essentially use it to erode, right, the surface of the object as well, right? And there is a maximum depth and a maximum height, right? If it's truly black, that's the maximum depth I'm going to get, and if it's truly white, that's the maximum height I'm going to get. However, if I go to my materials and I select my material, the little icon over here, I can come down here and go to my bump channel, and I can actually, right, I could increase the strength of my bump channel, right, and though that looks terrible, I could get, you know, significantly stronger impacts from that, right? Or again, I could reduce it, I could actually flip it so it's, right, so these areas that are black are pushed out and the white areas are pushed in. You know, it really depends on, you know, what you want. So we've got that. So now what we would like to do is, let's say we want to say, oh, now we need to do reflectance. We want this to be shinier and we don't want it to be evenly shiny. We want to actually be able to make some areas more reflective and some areas less reflective. So how do we do that? To do that, the first thing we do is we select our material and we go to texture, and there's this material channels option at the top, and you'll see that color and bump are highlighted in blue. To add an additional channel, we'd need to go to any of these and click on it, right? So like if I want, let's see here, let's do diffusion. No, let's do alpha. Alpha is pretty hilarious, right? So one thing it does is it automatically sets it to the same resolution as the other ones. It tells you what mode, right? Grayscale in this case, which is what we want, and currently the color is black. Now, that might be problematic. We're going to see what happens when I do this. Yeah, so when you have your alpha channel set to black, everything disappears completely. So if I go to colors and I make sure this is, I'm going to go 100% white, and I use my brush, I should be able to go to, let's see here, materials, make sure I'm here, make sure that I am able to draw on my alpha channel. And then as I do this, right, I'm actually only making a very thin part of the snake visible right now, right? Right, the rest of the snake is completely invisible, right? So I just have this little edge, which looks honestly pretty cool. But right, that's all I've got going on is that little bit of stuff that I've painted that's now opaque. So I'm actually going to go ahead and for the purposes of this, I'm going to go to my material channels. I'm just going to turn alpha channel off. Because, right, that's not really what I'm going for. What I want is reflectance, but if I go to texture and I go to material channels and I go to reflectance layers, all I have is default specular, right? And so let's go ahead and go to we have our material selected. Let's come down here to this material, click on the basic tab, and you'll see that we have these, right, our different channel options. And so if I go to reflectance, I can add additional layers, right? So let's go ahead and add a GGX or a Beckman layer, and we're just going to leave it at the default settings, right, which is 100% reflective, which means this is basically almost going to disappear. And so we could, adjust the brightness here. We're going to leave it alone for the time being, and we're going to come back up here to texture. Going to go to material channels, and if I go to reflectance layers, now you'll see I have the option of choosing layer 1 or default specular. So I'm going to choose layer 1, and I'm going to create my material. I'm going to hit OK. And now that I've done that, right, it also came in as black, so I have absolutely zero reflectance right now, right? But I'm still drawing on my alpha channel, so I need to turn that off, and then I need to turn on the reflectance channel. And I've got my brush, and so now if I wanted there to be, say, reflectance on these red dots, right? And I'm just using this splattery brush because it's the one I have selected. But so then I can come in here and say, let's see what this looks like if I do a really poor job drawing on top of these. But all right, and I'm just using a trackpad right now. It's like absolutely miserable to do this. But you can use other tools. And so now if I render this, right, I've got these areas where you can kind of see that, oh, I don't know why that didn't, right, where it looks a little bit different. Now, if I go ahead and was to add a light to my scene, I'd probably get a better result from that in terms of reflection. So let's go ahead and switch layouts to standard. I'm going to go ahead and create a light. I want to make sure that I'm actually going to make it an area light, and I'm going to have area shadows turned on. And then under details, I'm just going to go ahead and do fall off as well. And then now I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm in model mode, and I'm going to move this thing. I'm going to scale the light down a little bit, lift it up pretty high, maybe zoom out a few times, there we go, and then rotate it so it's kind of pointed down at the object. Make sure that this fall off is bigger, and then select it one more time and check mark show and render, or sorry, show and reflection. And that way, if I come down here and render this, right, I should at least see some of those little specular highlights. And if I adjust my position a little bit, yeah, you can kind of see where that's being more reflective than it was previously. So let's go back to our 3D paint. And you can see the other reason why I'm not getting 100% here is because, right, this color is currently not fully white, and so it's not 100% opaque, right? So I've set that to fully white now. I've got this set. I'm actually on here. So if I wanted this to be really reflective, say on this head somewhere, right, then now that this is 100% white, you can see that I'm actually, right, painting on this highly reflective surface, right? I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And the same would go for any of these patches that I had started before, right? They are now, right, if I was to go in and do this one and, oops, and render this, right, it looks almost like I've drawn a hole in it because, right, it's reflecting the infinite sky at this point, right? And so I'd have to get my camera in a place where I can actually see the light reflected in that surface, right? So, right, this should probably show, yeah. So you can see where that is now highly reflective, whereas the rest of this is absolutely completely flat. And so if I wanted to come in here and say, oh, I want to paint most of the rest of this more of a gray color, what I can do is I can say, okay, I'm on my reflectance channel. I'm going to go to my colors. I'm going to create a new layer. And actually, I probably need to create probably 2 new layers, because what I'd want to do is actually, I don't know if you can move the background. Oh yeah, you can. Great. Okay, so I could change, I'd have to change the blend mode and stuff, but in this case, let's say I want the background to be somewhat shiny. So I'm going to go ahead and I want it all to be uniform. So what I need to do is I need to go to colors once I have a layer selected. And I would need to choose, like, okay, I want it to be, you know, maybe 50%. So then under the gradient tool, I can use the fill layer option, and that will automatically fill that entire layer with whatever color I had selected, right? And so if I render this now, right, everything should be, you can see this is now shiny, but it's not so shiny that it's totally blocking out every right, that's covering up the color underneath, right? And so you can have many different reflectance layers as well, right? So if I wanted one, you know, this one is like pure and clean. If I wanted to go back to my materials and select this material and go to reflectance and add another layer, I'm going to do a Beckman. But then if I come down here, I can, you know, increase the roughness and make it super rough, and maybe make the specular strength higher, and then change this from normal to add, right? So that these are actually being added to one another. And then once I've set that up there, I just need to come back up to texture, material channels, reflectance layer, and go to layer 2, if I can actually not do that without spazzing. Right, and then again, this would set it so that it's not visible at all to start with, which is what I want. And I can hit OK. And then I can make sure that on this reflectance now, you'll see I have, this is my first layer in my reflectance. Sorry, this is my first layer in my reflectance. This is my second layer in my reflectance, if that makes sense. Right, so this is layer 2 that I have selected. If I come over here, I'm actually selecting layer 1 of the reflectance layers. So if I select this, and again, you'll see there's these X's here. That means that I have 1 layer in this, and this one actually has 3. And so if I wanted to add an additional layer here, I can go in here, add a layer, and then if I come back to this material, you'll see now I have this empty layer here. And this is where I can paint. And so I'm going to go ahead and see what my colors are. It's at 50%. I'm going to make it a little bit brighter than that. And I'm going to go to brushes, and I'm going to choose a brush that, I don't know, it looks totally ridiculous. So I'm going to go ahead and try and choose that brush. I've got my brush selected, make the size a little bit bigger, and the spacing is probably fine. And so I'm just going to come over here. I'm just going to draw with this brush all over this surface. And we'll see what it looks like when I get done. Okay, so then I can go ahead and render this. Right? And because they're additive, I don't really see the 2 different materials set up, but you can already see with that bump channel, the bump stuff that I did, you can see a lot of coarseness on there, which is really nice. And so if I'm not 100% on that, then maybe what I need to do is increase the intensity here and actually go to my materials, select this material again, and just set this to normal. And if I render this, even though it says normal, you can see where, oh, I'm drawing on the color channel. That's why I didn't see anything. So, right? Oh, the joy of using this interface. So I'm going to turn the color off, turn this on. I have this set. I'm going to go back down here and make this add, so I can actually see through that. And now I'm going to go ahead and draw with this on that channel. And if I go ahead and render this, right, now I've got these 2 different types of reflectance. right? I've got this version here that's like, you know, almost fully white. Oops, and something happened there. There we go. And it's much more diffuse. And you can see that my brush is actually, you know, pretty pixelated when I'm this close in. That's something to be aware of, is checking that and making sure it's not too much. And so if I, let's see here, if I go back and say layers, or say colors, and I reduce this down some, and pull out a little bit here, and paint over here some, and on top of some of these areas where I had other things, and render this again, right? You can see that, right, where that's where it's really reflective, and here it's just sort of flattening out that reflectance, and sending those specular highlights a little bit further away. And so this is the essence of body paint, right? This is why we've done all this work with these UVs, is so that we can have uniform and reliable and application of paint onto our surfaces. And you can see, you can't really see the brush strokes that I just did, but you can see where it's kind of dulled it, right? There was a highlight all the way through here. Oops, there was a highlight all the way through here, and I've really smudged that out a little bit with this other layer. Yeah, so hopefully this gives you at least the start of some of the ways that you can work with body paint to create your own materials and textures in Cinema4D. And obviously, the more experience you have doing digital painting, the more variety you can have here. And we haven't talked about all these other tools, but if you've ever used Photoshop, right, the clone tool, there's blur, sharpen, and smear, right? All of the standards are here, and there's even, you can even add text and polygon shapes as well, right? And there's dodge and burn and sponge. All of these things are available. You know, the only thing that works a little differently is the fill layer or fill bitmap, but the gradient tool works pretty similarly. And there are selection tools as well. There's magic wand and rectangle selection and all of that. Most of the time for the rectangle selection, you probably want to be in texture view to be doing those types of selections. All right, and that is what I've got. So hopefully this is a really useful tutorial that shows you how to work with body paint. One last thing that I neglected to mention before I hit stop on the screen recording a second ago is that what we're doing is we're generating a whole bunch of auxiliary files that are required in order for us to be able to see these textures, right? And they are separate from our Cinema4D file, right? They're a bunch of image files, right? You can imagine them as like images and textures that we've been bringing in already, except these are ones we're generating. And so when we go to save the file, we need to be really cautious about what we're doing so that we don't lose all of this work that we did. And so what you need to do is you need to go up to File, and the easiest way to save this is to go to Save Project with Assets, right? We can also save our textures, but if we just say Save Projects with Assets, and then what this does is, I don't have any idea why it's spitting it in this weird place, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in the correct folder. I'm going to call this, you know, snake paint or something like that. What it does, and we'll show this in a second, is I hit save, and it's going to take its time because what it's doing is it's saving all of the texture files that I've generated for these different layers. And once I've made that save, if I go to my, if I go and find that folder, and I can't remember if I did it in, no, I don't even remember if I did it here or where. Here we go. So what it's done is it's created a folder called Snake Paint. And within that folder is my snakepaint.c4d file, and this text folder that has all of the image files or the textures that I'm using, right? And so, you know, I've got this matte dot one color TIFF, right? That's, you know, we've seen that, right? That's what I've been working on. This is the bump channel that we've painted. This is the matte 4, right? This is one of the reflectance. I don't remember what this one is. It's probably reflectance as well, right? And then again, this is the alpha channel one, right? And so all of those textures, everything is saved in one place in a folder, right? This makes it so much easier if you have a question or an issue. You can't just upload, you can't just send me your C4D file without this text, without your textures with it, right? Because otherwise all I see is like black materials in it, and I can't be of any help. So, you know, make sure that you go to File, Save Project with Assets in order to save the project with any images that you're working on, and then you can just compress this folder and send it to me as a zip file.